There's a common mistake a lot of people make when they go out to the woods that makes them look like such a noob. It announces to everyone around them that that person does not know what they're doing out here and they just don't belong. I'm going to show you what this one thing is, so when you go out in the woods, you don't look like a noob, and maybe more importantly, so people who do know what they're doing out in the woods don't point and laugh at you and go, "What a noob." You don't want to be on the receiving end of that. Right off the bat, I'm going to tell you what it is that newbies do that give themselves away immediately. Then we'll go into the solution, what you can do to prevent this. What they'll do is say something like, "Over by that pine tree over there." That's not a pine tree, that's a fir tree, a Douglas fir tree. Bam! You just identified yourself as a noob. Or they could be walking around out in the woods not paying attention to where they're going. I just ran into this pine tree. This isn't a pine tree, it's a white fir. What a noob. A lot of people think if a tree has needles, therefore it's a pine tree. But there are all kinds of trees that have needles that are not pines. Fir, spruce, larch, hemlock, but they call them all pines even though a lot of them are not pines. I mean, you wouldn't go up to a broadleaf tree and call it an oak just because it has broad leaves. Well, this one you would because it's an oak. We don't have to get all crazy here. You're not going to have to learn what all the trees are because I'm going to give you a secret weapon. If you use this secret weapon to call these trees instead of calling them pine trees, not only will they not point and laugh at you, but they'll probably look at you with a little bit of respect and think, that person knows what they're talking about. Before I do that, I'm going to quickly show you the simple, obvious difference between pines and non-pines. If you just know that, you'll be way ahead of most people out there. This is a pine tree, and it's much different than those firs. One of the more noticeable differences, look how long these needles are. And the needles on a pine come in bundles. With this ponderosa pine, it's bundles of 3. Compare that to this Douglas fir over here. These have a much different look. There's a big difference between pine trees and non-pine trees. Pine tree on the right, non-pine tree on the left. Pine needles grow in this radial pattern, making a big circle at the end of each branch. On mature pine trees, you have this flaky bark. Unlike this Douglas fir, the bark is solid, not flaky. If we come back here to these fir trees, take a closer look. They don't have long needles, they don't grow in bundles, just individual needles growing out of the twig. The needles are not arranged in those big circles. The pine have those big circles. Compare that to this Douglas fir. Pine, not a pine. Notice how the Douglas fir in the middle looks different than the pines surrounding it. The trees that are not pines have more of a Christmas tree look. The tree on the right is not a pine. The tree on the left is a pine. Notice the long needles and the big circles on the pine. I know I'm being repetitive here, but repetition is the mother of retention. I think it was some famous smart person who said that. Although they probably weren't very famous because I don't know who it was. It's starting to get hot now, time to get serious. Roll up our sleeves. Non-pines like these Douglas fir and spruce, they do have circular needles. They circle around the branch, but they're not big noticeable circles. The big circles on the pines, my mom always called those big wheels. Maybe that would help you remember them. And the firs and the spruce, they have these individual needles growing off the stem. They're not in bundles. Kind of like the fur on an animal. An animal has individual hairs or fur growing out of its skin. Maybe that's why they call them fir trees, because the needles grow similar to fur on an animal. But it's also like hair, like our hair. Our hair grows that way too. Why don't they call them hair trees instead of fir trees? Probably because they're fir trees, not hair trees. Calling them hair trees would just be weird. But what about the other trees like spruce and hemlock? How did they get their names? Well, let's think about this logically. Spruce trees, they have needles just like the firs do that grow out individually, just like our hairs grow individually out of us, sometimes if you go out, you need to first spruce up your hair so you look good. Huh? Spruce? What about hemlock? Well, hemlock, locks of hair. I think maybe the people who named these trees were thinking. Not all pines have the big circles or the big wheels. Sugar pine, these needles are shorter than the ponderosa, but they're still long, and they also come in bundles. These ones are in bundles of 5. But even though they do have shorter needles, they still grow in fairly big wheels, just not as big as the ponderosa and other pines. They still have that obvious pine look. This is very similar to white pine. There are other pines with different numbers of needles per bundle, but they all have that pine look. There are some pines with exceptions that aren't going to be so easy to identify, but really, how often are you going to run into those? Firs, Douglas firs, and even spruce have that more classic Christmas tree look. Hopefully I don't ruin Christmas for you here, but a lot of people say they love Christmas, they love that pine tree smell from the Christmas tree. There are some types of pine they do use in some areas for Christmas trees, but it's more likely going to be fir trees. You're probably not smelling that pine smell, you're probably smelling that fir smell. Not to take anything away from the smell of pines, pines do smell amazing. So do firs. I thought I said I was going to make that a short explanation of the differences. I'm not doing very well with that. Some of you might be thinking, but fir, spruce, hemlock, larch, they're all in the pine family. They're all pines. Not so fast there, Turbo. For example, apple trees are in the rose family. Would you go up to an apple tree and say, "Look, a rose tree"? Or would you take a bite out of an apple and say, "That was a crisp, tasty rose"? I don't think so. Lettuce is in the sunflower family. When you put your lettuce in your salad, do you call it sunflower? Celery is in the carrot family. Do you call your celery a carrot? I don't think so. I could go on and on with these for the rest of the day, but okay, let's do one more. You're watching YouTube videos. It's not like you have anything else to do. Peaches, plums, cherries, they are all in the rose family too. But if Martha Stewart was to go on national television, make a peach cobbler and call it a rose cobbler, or make a cherry pie and call it a rose pie, just because they're in the rose family, this time instead of sending her off to jail, they'd probably throw her in the loony bin. It's no different with fir, spruce, hemlock, larch. They're not pines, they're fir, spruce, hemlock, larch. If you call them pines, people are going to point and laugh at you. You might also be thinking, what's the big deal? I call a fir tree a pine tree. I don't know my trees, I'm not a forester. Yeah, it's okay, but do you want people to point and laugh at you? You might also be thinking, people wouldn't do that, they're not that rude. You don't know people very well, do you? I mean, it's not like I would ever point and laugh at someone for calling a fir tree a pine tree. Well, maybe. But just because I'm not pointing and laughing at you doesn't mean I'm not thinking about pointing and laughing at you. I think it says somewhere, maybe in the Bible, something like, he who thinketh about pointing and laughing at someone hath already committeth, point and laugheth at that person. It may have been worded a little different than that, but it was something like that. Another way to look at it, if you can learn the difference between a pine, which has long needles arranged in those big circles, individual circles all over the tree, and other trees that don't have that, when you go out in the woods, you could be the pointer and laugher adder instead of being the pointer and laugher adder-e. Not that I recommend you point and laugh at people, because they might get mad and they might punch you in the face. You don't want that. Or if you're the one getting pointed and laughed at, you might get mad, you might get embarrassed, you might punch them in the face, they get mad, you get in a fight, you end up in jail, there ends up being a lawsuit. See, there are plenty of reasons to learn the simple difference between a pine and a non-pine. We could go into the differences between fir, spruce, hemlock, the other needle trees, but that's not what this video is about. We might do that in another video. This one is just to show you the difference between a pine and a tree that is not a pine. Just trying to help you out here so you don't look like a noob. Or if you do want to look like a noob, now you know a great way to do it. Either way, you win. Now I'm going to give you that secret weapon I told you about earlier. With that, you won't even need to know the differences between the trees. Now you know the difference between a pine tree and a tree that isn't a pine tree, which is good, but with this, you won't even need to know that. If you show up in the woods, instead of saying, over by that pine tree, when you see a tree with needles and you don't know what it is, if instead you were to say, over by that conifer, if you went out in the woods and you throw down the word conifer for a tree with needles, people will look at you and think, I don't know what they'll think, but it'll be something good. The word conifer covers all of the cone-bearing trees, the trees with needles, the firs, the pines, all of them, and trees with scale leaves like juniper and a lot of the ones we call cedar. The word conifer covers them all. It's kind of like having your own get out of jail free card. If you were to throw down the word conifer, people would look at you like you were the person to be, except for maybe a few who might not know what conifer means, but now you could point and laugh at them. See, we've just taken you from being the pointer and laugher atter E to being the pointer and laugher atter er. We've completely flipped your status out in the woods. Some people might be tempted to call this an evergreen. They might say, over by that evergreen, which is almost as bad as calling a fir tree a pine tree. Okay, it's not nearly as bad as that. Even a lot of the people who are forest wise, the kind of people who would point and laugh at you for calling a fir a pine tree, they don't know the difference between an evergreen and a non-evergreen. At the end of the video, I'll put up a link and you can learn the difference between an evergreen and a non-evergreen. If you know that, you will be so far ahead of everybody out in the woods. You'll go from the person who they point and laugh at to the person who they're looking up to thinking, well, they'll be thinking good things. Actually, this is the end of the video. I better put that up there now. Watch that. If you do, you will be the person to be. You'll be able to point and laugh at pretty much everybody.